to use the scanner, because this woman was pushing, and there was a breech. The baby was breech, and so she spent time getting a machine to verify the finding. When the woman was ready to push, anyway, they whisked her, of course, down past the nurse's station where I was standing, and took her to theatre and carried out a caesarean section. That's also something of interest, but not for today. This caring business was very important, and the way in which midwives demonstrated or didn't demonstrate their care for the machines or the women. So in the analysis phase then, there was this huge tension between the use of the traditional skills and the technology skills. And then there was this huge influence of policies and guidelines, and that brings me back to the woman being whisked past the nurse's station straight into theatre for a caesarean section, because that was the policy. She'd come in and it was an undiagnosed breech, and so that was the policy. No decision to be made by the midwife, straight to theatre. And the communication, the way in which the decisions are made, who communicates them, and the communication with the woman, and whether the machines have any influence in that communication. The decision making, I've already talked to. So there's this quite complex map of how it all fits together, or how it all should fit together with the appropriate use of technology. So, having started out with this idea that I was going to describe this typology of birth technology competence, which was going to be it. This is going to be the way that midwives operate with technology. I actually ended up with this complex thing where there were three typologies that I had to describe. So it wasn't quite so straightforward. The relationships were complex and based on different values and beliefs of the midwives. So the three typologies, I've called them bureaucratic competence, classical professional competence, and new professional competence. And the six elements that were involved, really: the decision making, the belief in the physiological process, the traditional midwifery skills, individual clinical judgment, and the belief in efficacy of the technology, and the role of the policies and guidelines in decision making. The role of policies and guidelines was something that actually hadn't jumped out of me at the literature stage. I was aware, obviously, because we were all aware of the policies and guidelines, but it was only through the ethnographic observations that I really became aware of quite how important the whole policies and guidelines things were in midwives' decision making, and how much they relied upon them. So in terms of the different typologies, the italics show the typology which really defines, that shows the element that really defines the typology. So in the bureaucratic competence, overall the midwives are governed by the guidelines and policies, and so a lot of the decisions are made in this kind of bureaucratic mode. This is what the guidelines say I should do, and that's what I'm doing. So there's less in the way of making any clinical decisions, much more reliance on going to seek a doctor's opinion to validate your decision to use technology and to go down the route of the guidelines. And a tendency not to trust the physiological processes, or not to be sure entirely of the physiological processes. The classical professional competence, the decisions are made by the professionals, and I'm kind of glad that Michael Robson isn't around, but it's that kind of notion that the professional makes a decision, and it's based on what the professionals think is best for the woman, and so we'll make the decision for you. And these are midwives who believe that they are doing the best for their clients. They're not just being overpowering and overbearing. They're making decisions which they think are in the best interest of their clients. Let's rupture the membranes and put up some syntocinon so we can get things moving and get on with it, and then she doesn't have to hang around in hospital for so long. And one of the midwives actually said that during the observations. And they do use their individual clinical judgment in that, based on their experience and their intuitive knowledge. And so the midwife who did that said, oh well, this woman, she's going to be hanging around for ages. If we send her home, she's only going to come back in again. We may as well get it all over and done with now that she's here, and put the syntocinon up. And as far as she was concerned, that was the right decision for that woman. The new professional competence then is this woman-centred approach, I guess, that we're all striving for, involving the woman in the decision making, with a belief in the efficacy of the physiological processes, and having to some extent a belief in the efficacy of the technology, but having it in its place almost. And is to some extent governed by the policy and guidelines, because we all are. There is no escaping from that. But also being able to exercise traditional skills. Now that was my model that was constructed out of my experiences, my observations, the literature, the synthesizing of all of the work that had gone before. And I thought, well, I can't leave it at that. You can't. You need to, in some way, find out if this is real, or if this really is just the perception of the theorist. So I took it back to the midwives who had been involved in the observations. Now I did do this with my knees knocking a little bit, because some of it isn't really particularly flattering. And I developed vignettes to illustrate the three typologies, one vignette for each typology. Handed out the vignettes after I described the typology, and asked the midwives to match the vignettes that I had given to the typologies, which they did. And then we had a discussion about what they thought of it. Did they recognise this as real? Is this really what went on in practice, or was it a figment of my imagination? And too many long nights in front of the computer and too much coffee. But they agreed. They agreed that this existed, but actually what they wanted to do with it was to put it into a hierarchy, which is what they did. They said to me that the bureaucratic competence sits at the bottom. That's a kind of entry-level competence for newly qualified midwives. You go in, you're using the guidelines because it's difficult to make a decision if you haven't got guidelines to follow. So you're going in at that level. But then they also said, if you're a midwife and you've been in practice for years and something dreadful happens to you, there's some catastrophic event, then the next time you go into the labour ward, you are going to feel shaky. So you want to go back to that. So it's a kind of, you'll step back into that bureaucratic mode because it feels safe. So it's a kind of a default position then, if you like. The classical professional competence. A lot of the midwives said that they veered between the kind of new professional and classical professional when they talked about their practice, and when they talked about their decisions and about their practice within the focus groups. Actually, what they were describing in most instances was classical professional competence. However, they did say to me that the kind of new professional competence was the aspirational goal. This was where we want to be as midwives. We want to be with women. We want to involve them in the decision making. And then they gave me a whole list of reasons why they couldn't be operating like that, because it was too time consuming, because the doctors wouldn't let them, or the policies wouldn't let them, or women wouldn't let them. So in terms of the hierarchy, this was something that they developed. Now, where did that leave me? Dazed and confused, really. For me, the training and assessment of competence in technology use is really important. It's something that midwives don't like to really think about too much, and but it's got to be part of the curriculum. And I think as part of the training within a curriculum, we have to think of appropriate use of technology and be guided in that, and be guiding our students in the direction of that new professional competence model. You know, using the technology, but using it within its place, identifying what the appropriate use of technology is. There needs to be clearly some kind of training in clinical decision making, and how to work in that new professional mode, and something about women-centred care. You know, how are we doing that? How do you do individualised care within a system that is designed to care for large numbers of women, not just one woman at a time? So this needs to move forward, this work. There's more work to be done, and I can see what that work is. And I, like everybody else, am looking for PhD students who want to come and do this work and take it forward and move with it and run with it, because I still think it's relevant. I still think there's work to be done from it. And I would very happily supervise somebody to do that work. There are some publications from this, the latest of which is the book chapter, which is part of your sneak preview of Roz's book. And thank you very much for that opportunity. And in my acknowledgements, of course, the people I would like to thank, as so many people here, I am eternally grateful to Marlene Sinclair, who has been my mentor and my guide and my supervisor for a few years now. And also George Kernahan and Sam Porter, who were also supervisors. And the other person I'd like to thank, who is, I don't normally thank at this stage because he's not usually here, but he is here today, and that's my husband, who actually lived through, he's outside the door, but who lived through the whole horrendous process of writing it all up, and who fed me and nurtured me and looked after me.